Interesting stories and memorable sessions. One of the last ones that I did in the 100 series was a date. My first experience with Flip Phillips. It was Flip and Kenny DeVerne and Bobby Rosengarten and George DeVivier and Dave McKenna. And it was a boiling session. It was just, because Kenny and Flip just loved one another. I mean, it was a session that was so good that when it came time for playbacks, George DeVivier, who never stuck around because he had another session 10 minutes later, he stayed and listened to the whole thing. So we knew it was good if George would stay. And we had finished up everything, and Kenny and Flip went their separate ways, and George went wherever he was going, and Bobby Rosengarten left. And so McKenna's still at the studio. And I says, "Come on, Dave, let's go have something to eat." And he says, "Okay." And so we went over to a place called the Blue Mill, which was over on Commerce Street. Really good place. It's gotten to be shishi and fancy and stuff. But it was in the building where my friend Bernice Abbott used to live in the 30s and 40s. Anyway, we went over there, and so we're having whatever we're having for dinner. And I says, "Dave, you seem like you want to hang out." And he says, "Yeah, I don't want to." Dave was staying at that time at in the guest bedroom at Phyllis Condon's. And he didn't want to go back. And I says, "Look, if you really are unhappy with and don't want to go home," I says, "why don't you come back to the studio? I have enough extra dough to pay you to do a solo record." And he says, "What do you have in mind?" And I says, "Nothing. We're going to go in. I'm going to put on I'm going to set up the piano. Piano's tuned in good shape because we just finished a record. Set up the record and put a reel of tape on the 2-track. And that'll last you. I'll put on a big reel that'll last you, 40 minutes or so. And going to turn the lights down, and I'm not going to say anything except time to go, time to start, and no starting and stopping in take 2 and take 3. And I just want you to give me 2 or 3 Bradley sets, just like you're in Bradley's and you're playing." And he said, "That sounds good," because there's no pressure, just sit down and play. And he did. And it was the last record I made with Dave, and it was one of the best. He just gave me Bradley sets. And it was, and I remember the cover for that record was done equally fast. He had a friend named Dave Young, who was a wonderful artist. And I needed the cover done in a day, and Dave did it in less than a day. He just went, he was very clever. That was one that's an interesting thing. One of the other remarkable ones, at least as far as I was concerned, when I left the CIA, I took all of my retirement money, which was maybe $10,000 or something after 13 years, and I plowed it back into making 2 records, one of which was a Buck Clayton jam session. And but the first Buck Clayton jam session probably had the most amazing thing happen in it, that I put together a band that Buck had chosen, and with 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, 4 saxophones, piano, bass, and drums, and Buck arrangements. And the first tune was, I think it was called Boss Blues or something like that. And the way that it was structured was that there'd be an ensemble, and Buck was conducting. He was standing out pointing at this and that. Buck was conducting, and we had made a sequence very much like George Avakian. I mean, and George was there. It was, copycatting what George had done with Buck in the 50s. And we made a list of the players who in a sequence, trumpet, trombone, whatever it was, and had written it out on a big blackboard, which was put in front of the band. And the deal was that, say, Joe Newman, who was one of the trumpet players, would play. There'd be an introduction, then Joe Newman would be first, and Joe would play a chorus, and then he would play a second chorus with Buck's ensemble writing underneath him. And then it would go to, say, Vic Dickinson or whatever. And so this was, I forget, I guess I could look at the record and I could tell you who went first and second and third, but it got to be Earl Hines' time. And Earl tears into something and is just really doing incredible stuff. And it's so incredible that everybody is just watching and listening. Nobody came in. The band didn't come in. And Earl just kept playing. And so in the middle of this one track, and at some point they figured it out, that it was time for everybody else to come in and so forth. And I remember that Zoot followed Earl. Zoot was the only one who had the nerve to follow Earl. But in the middle of this one track, there is a 12-minute piano solo of Earl doing all this incredible stuff. And which is why on the first record we had done it very carefully. I wanted 4 tunes, each one of which would be 12 to 15 minutes long. Well, this one track wound up lasting 27 minutes or something, which is why there was one track from the first session that didn't come out. It ultimately came out on a 4th LP, where I had extra material. So that was a good one. There was, when we did the first Joe Venuti and Zoot Sims, that had a crazy thing on it because we had done all these wonderful things, and the last tune was going to be Sea Jam Blues. And we knew that was going to be a really steaming, exciting, hot thing. And so da 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 da, and we're into it. And Zoot has, doing a steamy chorus. And here's Joe just sort of sitting there. And all of a sudden, he starts unscrewing his bow. Freddie Miller, my engineer, is looking at this, and he says, "Oh my gosh, what's going on?" Now, Freddie is a classically trained oboe English horn guy. He can read flypaper. He played with Stokowski when he was 16. He was really, his classmate in high school was Jerry Schwartz, who, led the Seattle Symphony for all those years, Pinky Zuckerman and so forth. And Freddie is looking at this, and Joe is taking his bow apart. And what Freddie doesn't know is that Joe is going to do the 4-string Joe bit. And he sees, and so Joe flaps the thing underneath and starts sawing away, and it all worked out. And it was a great recording. But Fred almost, he was just in a state of panic. Oh my God, what he's going to do? He's supposed to play. He's supposed to do this and that. And anyway, he was getting all ready. Joe Venuti never messed up, ever, except for the last record. And he messed up as good as you could mess. I loved the sonata form, and I had done Joe with Earl Hines, and it worked out very well. Actually, we even have a little video of that. But then I did Joe doing duets with Dave McKenna. And we're up in Albany, where we were doing it on the stage of the big old Palace Theater in Albany, New York. And afterwards, that one turned out just incredibly. And afterwards, Joe and I were talking about, let's do another project, Joe. And he says, what do you have in mind? I says, well, let's do a fun record. And he says, what do you? I says, look, Joe, you are legendary for telling all these tall tales and all these stories about, throwing your golf clubs in the lake and then throwing Crosby in the lake and, that kind of stuff. I says, why don't you, when you're back in New York, why don't you come down to the studio and we'll make a record of you doing nothing but telling really awful stories, the tuba story at the Plaza and that kind of thing. He says, that's a great idea. He says, what are you going to do with it? And I says, well, we'll put it out as a record. He says, how can you put that out as a record? And I says, I don't know. We'll make a special record and nobody can buy it unless they donate to some charity or something like that. And Joe says, hey, that's a good idea. You know what will make the charity? And I says, no, what's the charity? He says, we'll give all the money to Sister Annette at the convent. And so we had this plan that Joe Venuti is going to tell really naughty stories. The only way you can buy the record is if you write a check to Sister Annette at the convent. Because Joe really liked her. She was a wonderful piano player, and he would go to the convent, and she would accompany him playing old, pretty Fritz Kreisler songs, because, Joe could play all that stuff. Anyway, we had set a day for him to do it, and he called up the day it was a Sunday afternoon after a thing at Michael's, and he said, Hank, I can't make it. I said, what's wrong, Joe? He says, my voice is shot. I just can't make it. I'm coughing, and I can't do a talking record. Let's. I'll be here in a month. We'll do it then. And what it was the lung cancer really kicking in, and he was dead in a month. So that's the only one he messed up on. But there were many remarkable, interesting kind of things that happened with the session. Just totally, the sessions, I should say, that were totally unexpected. And I can only think of, at Downtown Sound, I can only think of a single instance where a musician messed up, didn't show up, other than the Dickie Wells situation. Nobody else ever. Everybody came to play. We had a good time. There was a ping pong table in the other room. We would have ping pong tournaments and things. Well, no, I can't tell that story because that's naughty. But there were just. I remember when DeVerne and Wellsted came in to do their Dick Wellsted and his famous orchestra featuring Kenny DeVerne. It was so cold in the studio that night. Somehow the furnace in the basement had screwed up, and we had to have heaters on. We were afraid the piano was going to go out of tune. because it had gotten so cold. And I mean, the two guys were. It turned out the record turned out pretty good, but it was a it was a struggle. But there were wondrous things because it was very casual. There were no clocks. It was my studio. I didn't have to say, hey, you have to go away. We don't have enough money to pay the studio bill or whatever. And and it was beyond that because it was the hall. Um, I mean, it was a place where, you know, Gil Evans got to come and rehearse for free, and you got to hear Gil Evans